Jimmy Butler remained silent, watched, and waited. When his former teammate Klay Thompson said those words that belittled him in front of millions, everyone expected Jimmy to respond. But he said nothing. Until that day. This wasn't just an MVP comment. It was the end of a friendship and the beginning of a reckoning. Don't forget to like and subscribe before finding out what happened. Now, if you're ready, let's start the story. That night, Jimmy Butler was like the god of basketball come down to earth. He broke through the defense one by one and sent his shots into the basket without missing a beat. And he led his team to victory. This wasn't just an all-star game. It was also a message. Every dunk, every three-pointer, every fast break seemed to say, "I'm still here, and I'm still on top." When he was handed the MVP award at the end of the game, no one was surprised. The audience, the media, and his former teammates. Of course, everyone already knew he deserved it. Jimmy didn't just play, he stole the show. As his name echoed through the stands, social media was already buzzing with Butler videos. But in the midst of all the excitement, there was one statement that sent a chill down everyone's spine. And that statement came from Klay Thompson. During the post-game interviews, the microphone was handed to Klay. The question was quite ordinary and simple, so much so that it was a media reflex. What do you think of Jimmy Butler's MVP performance? There was no fluster in Klay's eyes. He didn't smile or even pause. Only those words came out of his lips. Tatum should have won that award. But those words were not as light as any of Jimmy's three-pointers on the court. This was not just an MVP comment. It was like the first cold blow from an old friend. Because Klay was not just anyone. He was a teammate who had sweated in the Golden State Warriors jersey alongside Jimmy for years, won championships, and even silenced all the critics. The duo was known as Quiet Fire and Splash. When Jimmy's quiet but fiery leadership combined with Klay's deadly shots, the Warriors were almost unbeatable. But that period was now gone. Jimmy had moved on to the Heat, while Klay remained with the Warriors. And now, one of the former brothers was talking about the other as if he didn't know him at all. The reactions were, of course, immediate. NBA Twitter exploded like a bomb. "Are you serious, Klay? What's with the coldness? How could you treat your old friend like that? Jimmy carried you for years, and this is how you repay him." Some defended Klay, saying he was just being honest. Tatum played great too, they said, but most people knew he deserved much more than that. Jimmy chose to remain silent that night. He accepted his award, congratulated his teammates, and gave his usual answers to the press. Then he bowed his head and walked into the tunnel. He was holding the shiny MVP trophy in his hands, but there was a shadow on his face, because that sentence in the speech was the first shadow cast over the victory on the court. Tatum should have won that award. This sentence was not just an opinion. It was a sign of a rift. Jimmy may not have said it out loud that night, but he could feel it deep down inside. Nothing would ever be the same again. The man who had risen with him was now standing in front of him, questioning his award. This was no longer a debate about the MVP. It was the cracking of a brotherhood. And perhaps this was the beginning of a much bigger story. Jimmy Butler arrived at the Miami Heat training ground much earlier than usual the next morning. He was quiet. There were no cheerful greetings. His teammates noticed his mood, but no one dared to ask him anything. He didn't crack a smile once during practice. He shot, defended, and sweated. But it was clear that his mind was elsewhere. With every rebound, every pass, he still had those words in his head. Tatum should have won that award. He picked up his phone in the locker room. Social media was going crazy. Klay's words were trending. Some comments were supportive, while others slammed Klay. But for Jimmy, it wasn't so much what was said as who said it. Klay Thompson, the man he had fought alongside for years, the man he had leaned on. the man who had been by his side in his most difficult moments, who had remained silent and let his game do the talking. Now, he was standing in front of the media, looking him straight in the eye and trying to devalue him. Jimmy stared blankly at his phone screen. As his fingers scrolled through the notifications, a tweet caught his attention. It was a clip from Draymond Green's podcast. Draymond said, "Steph, okay, Jimmy. He deserved it." But for Klay to say, that is a betrayal of brotherhood. At that moment, Jimmy's throat tightened. He hadn't spoken to Draymond in years, but those words touched him deeply. Maybe there were still some people who understood. The next day was the press conference. The media room was packed to the brim. Everyone was eagerly and curiously waiting to hear what Jimmy would say. Would he respond? Would he swallow his words? Or would he break his silence and speak the truth? When the microphone was handed to him, Jimmy raised his head and looked directly into the camera lens. He took a deep breath before beginning to speak. Then he began to speak in simple, unadorned words that were heavier than stone. "It's true that Jason Tatum is a great player. I have endless respect for him. But as you all know, the MVP award is given for performance. And my performance, as you can see, is quite obvious. Unfortunately, some people may not accept this, but that's not a problem for me. Because I know who I am and what I deserve." A deep silence fell over the hall. Jimmy paused for a few seconds and then continued. "But yes, that comment was a little disrespectful." These words echoed in the hall for a while. Jimmy had spoken directly for the first time, but he didn't name names or make any accusations. However, the message was clear. He was actually very hurt, and that hurt said much more than words could ever say. After the interview, social media began to stir once again. Comments saying Jimmy is hurt, clips, and analysis videos were flying around. This was no longer just a matter of MVP, but the immeasurable weight of the past. There was still no word from Klay's side, but everyone knew that a response would come, and that response would determine everything. It was no longer a question of who played better, but who valued the other more. In essence, it had become a test of respect. And Jimmy was definitely being tested, because he had broken his silence and said what was on his mind. Now it was Klay's turn, of course. Klay Thompson's response came surprisingly quickly. The day after the press conference, he had a brief conversation with journalists after the Dallas Mavericks practice. There was only one question to ask. It was simple, but a bit heavy. Jimmy Butler said your comment was a bit disrespectful. What do you think? Klay turned to the camera, bowed his head slightly, and responded with just one sentence. "I stand by what I said." The reporters wanted to probe a little further. Maybe he would back down. Maybe he would explain. But it was useless. Klay didn't budge an inch. He just shrugged his shoulders and walked away quickly. This response had a much greater impact than Jimmy's words. Because this was no longer passive tension, it was an active display of confrontation, like a volcano about to erupt. Social media once again exploded with this bombshell news. Some said, "Klay has no regrets." Others rebelled, asking, "How can you turn your back on your former teammate like that?" However, the most striking reaction came from Jimmy's teammates. The topic was now being openly discussed in the Miami Heat locker room. Bam Adebayo said after a practice, "If someone does something unfair to our leader, it's essentially done to all of us. This isn't just about Jimmy. It's personal for us as well." These words were like a fire thrown into the icy tension. It seemed as if an invisible war had begun, not just between Butler and Thompson, but between the two teams. NBA commentators described the situation as a silent playoff war. This was because both teams were almost neck and neck in the Western Conference standings. And if things continued like this, it seemed inevitable that they would face each other in the playoffs. Jimmy was alone when he heard Klay's response. He was sitting in a hotel room under dim lighting, staring out the window. The answer was short, clear, and definitive. There was no turning back now. When he felt it, something inside Jimmy had already snapped. This was no longer just disappointment. It was a challenge. The man he had leaned on for years was now standing in front of him, and he was not backing down. He picked up his phone, turned it on, and silently logged into Twitter. He posted a short sentence. "It's recorded. The game is on." It was a very short sentence, but it meant a lot. Jimmy was done with responding. Now it was time to prove himself on the field. He increased his participation in training significantly. He would arrive at the gym at 6 in the morning and work out on his own for 2 hours before everyone else arrived. He had locked himself in, not just physically, but mentally as well. Coach Spoelstra said in a press conference, "This guy is in war mode right now. He's forgotten about everyone else and is focused solely on his goal. I've seen many of his methods before, of course, but this looks completely different." And finally, the league schedule showed the day of the game. Miami Heat, Golden State Warriors. As the regular season was coming to an end, this game was no longer just about the standings, but had become a showdown of great importance. All tickets were sold out within a few hours. National broadcasters had scheduled the game for prime time. Everyone was eagerly awaiting this moment. When game day arrived, the entrance to the arena was packed with press. As the teams took to the court to warm up, all eyes were on two people, of course: Jimmy Butler and Klay Thompson. They were careful not to make eye contact. They didn't even greet each other. But their body language seemed to say it all. This game was definitely going to be a showdown, and the winner would not be determined by the score alone. When the first whistle blew, the atmosphere in the arena changed. The spectators were silent, holding their breath. Because everyone seemed to know that tonight was not just about basketball. Miami had the first ball. Jimmy Butler took the ball and headed for the basket. Klay was facing him. Neither of them made eye contact. But every step, every breath, and every touch carried traces of the past. Jimmy made a hard drive toward the basket on the first attack. Klay responded with chest-to-chest defense. A foul was called. Jimmy went to the line. The crowd cheered, but Jimmy was silent. He was just controlling his breathing. The tempo was high throughout the game. Klay was shooting from behind the three-point line while Jimmy dominated inside. After every score, the media cameras tried to capture their facial expressions. But both of them were like walls. In the second quarter, the two collided after a play. Jimmy fell to the floor, but Klay didn't even look at him. He turned back without saying a word. At that moment, a murmur spread through the arena. The fall was not physical, but symbolic. Jimmy got up, but the look in his eyes had changed. As he headed to the locker room at halftime, Jimmy's face was expressionless. Coach Spoelstra wanted to approach him, but Jimmy shook his head and walked away on his own, as if to say, "Don't come." Because tonight, this was going to be his battle alone. At the start of the third quarter, the difference was only 2 points. Klay was tight on defense and looked effective on offense. Jimmy, on the other hand, was in a deep, dark silence. But there was control in his every move, and the storm growing inside him was now clearly visible in his eyes. Towards the end of the fourth quarter, the score was tied. 3 minutes left. Jimmy had the ball. Klay faced him one-on-one once again, silently. There were no words between them, no facial expressions, only echoes of the past. Jimmy took a step back and shot. The arena froze as the ball was in the air. It hit the rim and went in. The score. The Heat was now in the lead. Jimmy turned around and didn't celebrate. He just turned his back and got into a defensive position. On the next attack, Klay responded. He sent in a three-pointer. Net. Golden State took the lead. This time, Klay was silent. No one showed their joy. This game had become a battle stripped of all showmanship. With 1 minute left, the score was tied. Everyone was on their feet, holding their breath. The teams took a timeout. Jimmy was on the sideline, his hand on his knee, breathing heavily with his head down. The coaches were talking, the players were listening. But Jimmy seemed to be in another world. The decision was made for the final attack. The ball was going to Jimmy. Coach Spoelstra looked him in the eyes and said, "Are you ready?" Jimmy didn't answer, just nodded. The ball was put into play. The clock showed 12 seconds. Jimmy crossed the midfield. Klay was in front of him. Everyone fell silent. The ball bounced once, twice, 3 times. Jimmy turned right, with Klay following close behind. 3 seconds left. Jimmy made a sudden turn and drove inside. Klay pushed him hard, but Jimmy slid past him and released the floater. The ball hit the rim, bounced up, bounced back down, and went in. The arena erupted in cheers, but Jimmy was silent. He just bowed his head and walked to the sideline. The game was over. Of course, the Heat had won, but this was more than just a victory. Klay sat down on the bench and bowed his head. As Jimmy passed by him, there was unfortunately no eye contact. But at that moment, both of them had the same expression on their faces. A period had come to an end, almost as if it would never end. At the press conference, Jimmy was asked, "How do you feel?" Jimmy remained silent for a moment, then replied with a simple sentence, "It wasn't the game. It was actually an answer." That night, the headlines were the same. Jimmy didn't talk again, he just played. Klay was silent. He made no statement. He just disappeared from view. But everyone knew very well that the story didn't end there, because some hurts heal not only with time, but with new confrontations. And the NBA calendar kept turning. As the calendar turned, scores changed, rankings shifted. But nothing was the same after that game. The media was still talking about Jimmy and Klay's confrontation. Old friends had become new rivals. When the Golden State Warriors lost several games in a row, Klay's performance began to be questioned. Some said that his emotional outburst had affected the team. Others still defended his ability to lead. The Miami Heat, on the other hand, maintained their momentum. Jimmy was quieter, but more effective. Not only on the court, but also in the locker room, his actions spoke louder than words. His silence was now a statement. When the playoff matchups were announced, no one was surprised. The Miami Heat and the Golden State Warriors were facing each other in the first round. The league announced this series as the Brothers at Arms series. The promotional video before the first game showed clips from the past, hugs, trophies raised together, and then the breakup. But in the background, one sentence stood out. Some battles start silently. When the series began, the atmosphere was much more tense than in regular season games. The first game was in Miami. The arena was, of course, packed, but the scoreboard wasn't the most watched thing. Jimmy and Klay's body language was more important than the scoreboard. Jimmy scored 32 points in the first game, and the Heat won. In the second game, Klay responded with 27 points, tying the series. After every game, the press constantly watched to see if the two players would greet each other. But Jimmy was always the same. At the end of the game, he would just say, "I speak on the court." Klay, on the other hand, tried to close the subject several times by saying, "It's just a series." But his eyes actually said it all. A minor collision after the third game raised tensions for a while. Jimmy fell to the ground after Klay's momentary intervention as he was going for the basket. The foul whistle blew. As Jimmy got up, he locked eyes with Klay. The arena fell silent again. Jimmy just shook his head. Klay responded in the same way. No one said anything, but everyone understood at that moment. There was still unfinished business in this story. The series had now moved to the seventh game. The battle continued until the final whistle. The score was still tied, and Miami had the last shot. And just like in their first confrontation, the ball went to Jimmy again. This time, it wasn't just Klay standing in front of him, but their entire past. Jimmy released the layup in the last second. The ball spun around the rim once, then fell in. The Heat advanced to the next round. The Warriors were eliminated. The arena was transformed into a celebration, but Jimmy was silent as usual as he approached the sideline. Klay was sitting on the bench. Jimmy came over to him. This time, he stood in front of him. And finally, they looked each other in the eyes. They just stared at each other for a few seconds. Then Jimmy extended his hand in a noble and civilized manner. Klay responded in kind, but no one could hear what they said. But the exhaustion and respect on their faces were now evident to everyone present. At the press conference, Jimmy was asked the final question. "Jimmy, what did you learn from this story?" Jimmy gave a short answer. "Some people leave quietly, but some come back quietly." Klay did not give any interviews to the press that night. But the next morning, he shared a single photo on social media. The moment he shook hands with Jimmy. He wrote just one sentence underneath. "The road is long, but some roads always intersect." This story may have come to an end, but in the NBA, every story bridges another story. And on this bridge, the words written in silence were the loudest. Jimmy proudly continued his career. So did Klay. The past they wrote together remained in their memories. But everyone knew that. Even if they became rivals again, the bond between them would always remain silent. Do you think a true friendship can be rebuilt after such a silent confrontation? Share your thoughts with us in the comments, and don't forget to subscribe to the channel for more stories like this.